Now, if you have been in my class, you will have heard about a lady called Mrs Pepperpot. Now, this is a different book than the one I have in school. This is a really old Mrs Pepperpot story. And there's something very, very special about Mrs Pepperpot. Now, a pepperpot would be about that size there and would sit on your table and you put pepper in it to shake on your dinner. So remember that a pepperpot is only about that size there whenever you hear this story and you hear about the strange thing that happens to Mrs Pepperpot. There once was an old woman who went to bed at night as old women usually do. And in the morning she woke up as old women usually do. But on this particular morning, she found herself shrunk to the size of a pepperpot. And old women don't usually do that. The odd thing was, her name really was Mrs Pepperpot. Well, as I'm now the size of a pepperpot, I shall have to make the best of it, she said to herself, for she had no one else to talk to. Her husband, Mr Pepperpot, was out in the fields and all her children were grown up and gone away. Now, she happened to have a great deal to do that day. First of all, she had to clean the house. Then there was all the washing which was lying in to soak and to wait to be done. And lastly, she had to make pancakes for supper. I must get out of bed somehow, she thought, and taking hold of a corner of the eiderdown, she started rolling herself up in it. She rolled and rolled until the eiderdown was like a huge sausage which fell softly on the floor. Mrs Pepperpot crawled out and she hadn't hurt herself a bit. There's her bed and there's the eiderdown or the blanket curled up like a sausage, and there's tiny Mrs Pepperpot. The first job was to clean the house, but that was quite easy. She just sat down in front of a mouse hole. And she squeaked until the mouse came out. Clean the house from top to bottom, she said to the mouse, or I will tell the cat about you. So the mouse cleaned the house from top to bottom. Mrs Pepperpot called the cat. Here, Puss Puss, lick out all the plates and dishes, or I will tell the dog about you. And the cat licked all the plates and dishes clean. Then the old woman called the dog. Listen, dog, you make the bed and open the window, and I will give you a bone as a reward. So the dog did as he was told. And when he had finished, he sat down on the front doorstep and waved his tail so hard that he made the steps shine like a mirror. There's the cat licking out all the dishes. And there's the dog opening the window. You'll have to get the bone yourself, said Mrs Pepperpot. I haven't time to wait on people. She pointed to the windowsill where a large bone lay. After this, she wanted to start her washing. She had put it in the brook or the river to soak, but the brook was almost dry. So she sat down and started muttering in a discontented sort of way. I have lived a long time, but in all my born days I never saw the brook so dry. If we don't have a shower soon, I expect everyone will die of thirst. Over and over again she said it, all the time, looking up at the sky. At last, the rain cloud in the sky got so angry that it decided to drown the old woman altogether. But she crawled under a monk's hood flower. Look, there's the flower. And there's Mrs Pepperpot hiding underneath so she doesn't get wet. And she stayed snug and warm while the rain poured down and rinsed her clothes clean in the brook. Now, the old woman started muttering again. I have lived a long time, but in all my born days I have never known such a feeble south wind as we have had lately. I'm sure that if the south wind started blowing this minute, it couldn't lift me off the ground, even though I am no bigger than a pepper pot." The south wind heard this and instantly came tearing along. But Mrs Pepperpot hid in an empty badger set. And from there she watched the south wind blow all her clothes right up onto the clothesline. Again she started muttering, "I have lived a long time, but in all my born days I have never seen the sun give so little heat in the middle of the summer. It seems to have lost all its power, that's a fact." When the sun heard this, it turned scarlet with rage and sent down fiery rays to give the old woman sunstroke. But by this time she was safely back in her house and was sailing about the sink in a saucer. There she is in her sink, there's the tap. And there she is in the saucer. Meanwhile, the furious sun dried all the clothes on the line. "Now for cooking the supper," said Mrs Pepperpot. "Mr Pepperpot will be back in an hour, and by hook or by crook 30 pancakes must be ready on the table." 30 pancakes? She had mixed the dough for the pancakes in a bowl the day before. Now she sat down beside the bowl and said, "Oh, I've always been fond of you, bowl. And I told all the neighbours that there's not a bowl like you anywhere. I'm sure if you really wanted to, you could walk straight over to the cooking stove and turn it on." And the bowl went straight over to the stove and turned it on. Then Mrs Pepperpot said, "I'll never forget the day I bought my frying pan. There were lots of pans in the shop, but I said, if I can't have that pan hanging right over the shop assistant's head, I won't buy any pan at all. For I'm sure that is the best pan in the whole world, and I'm sure if I were ever in trouble that pan would jump onto the stove itself." And there and then the frying pan jumped onto the stove, and when it was hot enough, the bowl tilted itself to let the dough run onto the pan. There's the frying pan on the stove. Then the old woman said, "I once read a fairy tale about a pancake which could roll along the road. It was the silliest story that I ever read, but I'm sure that the pancake on the pan could easily turn a somersault in the air if it really wanted to." At this, the pancake took a great leap from sheer pride and turned a somersault, just as Mrs Pepperpot had said. There's the pancake, can you see it? It's jumped out of the pan and flipped over. Not only one pancake, but all the pancakes did this, and the bowl went on tilting and the pan went on frying until before the hour was up, there were 30 pancakes on the dish. Then Mr Pepperpot came home, and just as he opened the door, Mrs Pepperpot turned back to her usual size. So they sat down and ate their supper. And the old woman said nothing about having been as small as a pepperpot, because old women don't usually talk about such things. And there's Mr and Mrs Pepperpot having their big plate of, how many pancakes were there? 30 pancakes. You'd definitely have a sore tummy if you ate 30 pancakes. So what did you think of Mrs Pepperpot? There's lots of stories about Mrs Pepperpot as well, and all the things that happen to her when she shrinks to the size of a pepper pot. So I hope you enjoyed that one. So see you tomorrow.